I came home from military deployment to find my grandfather's cabin reduced to splinters and rubble. The HOA president was waiting in my driveway with a smug smile and a demolition bill for $12,000 claiming I owed back fees that never legally existed. What she didn't know, my entire family works for the federal government. Dad's FBI white-collar crime, Mom's IRS criminal investigation, sister's ATF, and me, military intelligence. You can smell the diesel exhaust still hanging in the mountain air, mixed with the sweet scent of crushed cedar logs that held 4 generations of Christmas mornings and summer fishing trips. Standing in what used to be our kitchen, I'm looking at this woman who just made the biggest mistake of her corrupt little life. See, Vivian Blackthorne thought she was bulldozing some helpless military family's cabin. Instead, she just declared war on a federal task force disguised as Sunday dinner guests. What would you do if someone destroyed your family legacy out of pure spite? Where are you watching from? Drop your location below. Let me back up 18 months to when this whole nightmare started. I'm Marcus Sterling, 52, spent 25 years in Army logistics before I got smart and retired to the mountains. My Uncle Theodore left me this little cabin on what I thought was just another pretty lake in Colorado. The old guy was always the family oddball, lived like a hermit, but somehow had money stashed everywhere. The cabin wasn't much to look at, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a kitchen that belonged in 1970. But man, that view, sitting on the back porch with morning coffee, watching the mist rise off perfectly still water while loons called back and forth. That's what peace sounds like after decades of military chaos. The lake's shaped like a teardrop, 47 acres of pristine mountain water surrounded by 12 modest homes. Nothing fancy, just regular folks who wanted quiet retirement spots. At least, that's what I thought until I met Karen Whitmore. Karen moved in 3 houses down about 6 months after me. White BMW, white teeth, white lies. Everything about her screamed, "I don't belong here, but I'm taking over anyway." She's 48, sells real estate, and married to some city council wannabe named Derek. Within 2 weeks of unpacking, she was elected HOA president. Amazing how that works when you're the only one who actually wants the job. My first red flag should have been when she introduced herself. I was out on the dock, working on my boat engine, the Chris Craft I'd bought as a wreck and spent 3 years restoring. Every bolt, every piece of mahogany, every chrome fitting had been lovingly rebuilt. She clip-clopped down in those ridiculous heels, smiled her realtor smile, and said, "Oh, you're the military man. Well, I hope you understand we maintain certain standards around here." Certain standards. Like that phrase doesn't drip with condescension. The boat became her obsession. Too big, she said, too loud, didn't match the aesthetic vision she had for our waterfront community. Never mind that half the other docks had boats just as large, never mind that mine was probably the most beautiful vessel on the water. Karen had decided I was the problem, and Karen always got her way. The smell of her perfume, something expensive that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, lingered on the dock long after she left. But mixed with the honest scent of cedar shingles warming in morning sun and the creosote from old dock pilings, it felt like an invasion, like someone had sprayed artificial flowers in a real garden. That first violation notice arrived on a Tuesday. Crisp white paper, official HOA letterhead, and enough legal-sounding threats to intimidate anyone who didn't know better. Oversized recreational vessel violates community aesthetic standards per Covenant 14.7b. $200 daily until removed. Here's the thing about military training. It teaches you to gather intelligence before you react. So instead of getting angry, I got curious. Who was this woman who thought she could order around a retired Army officer on his own property? And more importantly, what didn't I know about Uncle Theodore's little gift that might change the game entirely? Because if there's one thing 25 years of logistics taught me, it's that the person with the best information usually wins. And something told me Karen hadn't done her homework nearly as well as she thought. Vivian's first major power move came while my boots were still muddy from German soil. She scheduled what she called an emergency HOA meeting on a Wednesday afternoon at 2 p.m. You know, when normal working people are actually working. Funny how these emergencies always seem to happen when the people being screwed can't show up to defend themselves. At this little gathering of 7 people in her living room, because that's how democracy works in Vivian's world, she railroaded through something called a special assessment resolution. Our cabin was now officially deemed in architectural non-compliance with community standards that didn't exist when my grandfather built the place. But here's where Vivian showed her true genius for bureaucratic warfare. She created a 47-page violation report. I'm not kidding. 47 pages for a simple family cabin. Our dock was excessively large at 12 feet by 8 feet. Our native wildflower garden was unapproved landscaping that disrupts neighborhood aesthetics. The fire pit my grandfather built for roasting marshmallows. Unregistered combustible hazard presenting clear and present danger to community safety. The woman managed to turn a family retreat into a federal disaster zone on paper, complete with backdated documentation to make it look like we'd been ignoring violation notices for months. While I was analyzing enemy communications overseas, Vivian was manufacturing evidence like a seasoned intelligence operative. When I finally returned from deployment, there was a stack of legal papers on my doorstep thick enough to stop shrapnel. The smell of mold had already started creeping through the cabin windows after months of forced neglect, that sour, musty odor that tells you something's dying inside walls that used to smell like pine and family dinners. That's when my training kicked in. In military intelligence, we treat every problem like an enemy operation. Map the players, identify motivations, trace communications, find weak points. So I cleared the kitchen table and started building a threat assessment board just like I'd done with Taliban networks in Afghanistan. I took our case to military legal aid, and Captain Rodriguez nearly spilled her coffee when she reviewed Vivian's paperwork. Sergeant Garrison, this is textbook violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act. They can't proceed with enforcement actions against deployed personnel without following federal notification protocols. That's when I learned something crucial. There are laws specifically protecting military families from exactly this kind of bureaucratic ambush while we're serving overseas. But the real shocker came when I contacted our property management company. My parents had hired them to handle basic maintenance during deployment, but they'd mysteriously stopped all services 3 months earlier. The manager finally admitted the truth. Vivian had threatened their contractor license unless they abandoned our property. She'd weaponized her construction industry connections to economically isolate siege warfare with building permits. So I went deeper, using the same systematic approach I'd used to map enemy networks. Public records, corporate filings, financial disclosures, all perfectly legal intelligence gathering. And buried in the Secretary of State database, I found pure gold. The HOA's corporate registration had expired 8 months ago. They had zero legal enforcement authority. Vivian had been running a ghost organization, like discovering your enemy forgot to actually form an army. The beautiful irony? While Vivian thought she was being clever, her BMW kept cruising past our property at surveillance hours 2 a.m., 5:30 a.m., random weekday afternoons. The sound of that German engine became my daily reminder that she was more worried about us than we should be about her. Amateur hour surveillance from someone playing intelligence games against an actual intelligence professional. Meanwhile, neighbors started whispering their own horror stories. The hardware store owner confided that certain customers were mysteriously unable to get construction supplies. 3 other lakefront families were facing identical harassment campaigns, same manufactured violations, same bureaucratic timing, same intimidation tactics. You could feel the community tension, that electric anticipation when people realize someone's finally going to fight back against the neighborhood tyrant. It reminded me of those moments before a mission when everyone knows the operation's about to go kinetic. Walking our property line with measuring tape and camera, the crunch of frost-covered gravel under my boots sounded like preparation for battle. Because that's exactly what it was. Vivian had declared war on my family while I was serving my country overseas. What she didn't realize is that she'd just handed a military intelligence analyst the perfect case study in domestic threat assessment. Every document she'd forged, every procedural shortcut she'd taken, every illegal coordination with contractors, it was all evidence now, cataloged with the same precision I'd used to track insurgent networks. The woman thought she was bulldozing a helpless military family. Instead, she'd given a federal employee a masterclass in how local corruption actually operates. 2 weeks later, Vivian escalated to what I can only describe as full-scale psychological warfare. She filed a public safety complaint with the county, claiming our dock posed an imminent drowning hazard to community children. Mind you, this is the same 12 by 8 foot dock where 3 generations of Garrison kids learned to swim without a single incident. But here's where her timing gets really interesting. She scheduled the county inspection for 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, right when normal working families would be at their jobs. Pure coincidence, I'm sure. The inspector was a guy named Dale Henricks, mid-50s. The kind of man who drives a lifted truck with truck nuts hanging from the hitch and calls everyone buddy, in that tone that means the exact opposite. What I didn't know then, but my ATF sister Mackenzie would discover later, was that Dale had been flagged in federal databases for accepting contractor kickbacks. The man had a talent for finding structural problems that required expensive fixes from his buddies in the construction business. Like a medical examiner who only finds causes of death that benefit the funeral home that pays his golf membership. I'd set up trail cameras around the property, perfectly legal on your own land, and a habit you develop when you've spent 18 months watching for insurgent activity. The footage was better than any Netflix thriller. Vivian and Dale walking our dock 3 days before the surprise inspection, measuring, photographing, having what looked like a very detailed conversation about structural integrity. The smell of his cheap cologne mixed with lake water would have been funny if it wasn't so obviously criminal. You learn to notice these details in intelligence work when people are trying to look official while doing something completely corrupt. Their tells become obvious. During the official inspection, Dale spent exactly 4 minutes examining our dock before declaring it structurally compromised and dangerous to public safety. His report claimed the support post showed advanced deterioration and imminent collapse risk. Funny thing about that, the dock had been professionally inspected and certified just 6 months earlier by a licensed marine contractor. But Dale's version made it sound like we'd built a death trap out of toothpicks and prayer. That evening, I called a family council of war. First time we'd all been together since my deployment, and the dining room felt electric with focused anger. Dad brought his FBI case files methodology. Mom had her IRS financial forensics mindset. Mackenzie came armed with ATF database access and a very particular set of skills for investigating people who abuse official authority. This is textbook racketeering, Dad said, spreading Dale's inspection report across the table. Using official processes for personal financial gain, coordinated with multiple actors. We're looking at federal RICO violations if we can prove the pattern. Mom was already pulling property tax records on her laptop. Vivian's been claiming adjacent properties as abandoned or condemned to reduce her own tax assessments. She's literally profiting from harassing her neighbors. That's when I learned something that would have been useful earlier. When local officials fabricate property problems, they often manipulate tax assessments to benefit themselves financially. But Mackenzie dropped the real bombshell. She'd run Dale through ATF databases and found something beautiful. He'd been involved in a 2019 bridge collapse that killed 2 people. His inspection license should have been permanently suspended, but somehow he was still operating illegally. The man conducting safety inspections was himself a safety hazard who'd already gotten people killed. Emergency inspections require specific statutory authority under Montana law, Mackenzie explained while printing database records. Most HOA emergencies aren't actually legal emergencies, they're just manufactured urgency to bypass proper procedures. The next morning, Vivian showed up with a construction crew, claiming she had authority to immediately secure the hazardous dock for public safety. Picture this: 5 guys with chainsaws and sledgehammers, ready to demolish property without a warrant, based on an inspection conducted by an unlicensed fraud who'd already killed people with his incompetence. This is where military training becomes very useful in civilian life. I stepped onto that dock, the supposedly dangerous, structurally compromised dock, and calmly informed them that they were trespassing on private property without legal authority. Everything recorded, everyone polite, but absolutely firm. "Ma'am," I told Vivian, "you're welcome to call the sheriff if you believe you have legal authority here. I'll wait." The look on her face was priceless, like someone who just realized their bluff got called by someone who actually knows the rules. You could hear the tension crackling like electricity before a thunderstorm. Her construction crew looked around nervously, probably wondering if destroying property based on fraudulent inspection reports was worth their hourly wage. The sound of chainsaws going silent was sweeter than any victory song. That's when I knew we had her. Vivian had escalated from paperwork harassment to attempted property destruction based on fabricated evidence. She'd just handed us enough federal crimes to keep prosecutors busy for months. 3 weeks later, Vivian went completely nuclear. Using Dale's fraudulent inspection report, she somehow convinced the county to issue an actual demolition order. Our family cabin, 4 decades of memories, built to last another century, was now officially condemned as an imminent threat to public safety and property values. But here's the thing about Vivian's psychological warfare. She had a real talent for timing. The demolition was scheduled for the Friday after Thanksgiving. You know, that perfect moment when families are digesting turkey and nobody's paying attention to local government paperwork, maximum emotional damage, minimum community witnesses. We were all gathered at the cabin for what we thought would be a normal Thanksgiving celebration. The smell of Mom's sage stuffing mixing with pine smoke from the fireplace. 4 generations of Garrison men arguing about football while the women rolled their eyes and made the real decisions. Normal family chaos, the kind that makes you grateful for the people who drive you crazy. That's when Sheriff's Deputy Martinez showed up at our door, hat in hand, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else on earth. "Ma'am, sir, I'm real sorry about this, but I have to serve you with a 48-hour evacuation notice." He handed over the paperwork with the expression of someone forced to kick puppies for a living. Deputy Martinez had served in Iraq, you can always tell, and he recognized military bearing when he saw it. "Look, Sergeant," he said quietly, "something smells fishy about this whole situation, but I'm legally obligated to serve these papers. Y'all might want to lawyer up fast." Here's what I learned about emergency demolition orders. They're supposed to require 10-day minimum notice under Montana law, with specific judicial review for properties that pose genuine public danger. But Vivian had somehow convinced a county judge that our cabin presented such immediate peril that normal legal protections didn't apply. I immediately got on the phone with military legal aid, treating this like the enemy action it was. Captain Rodriguez was furious when she heard the timeline. "Sergeant, this violates about 15 different due process requirements. Emergency demolitions need documented imminent danger, not just some inspector's opinion about dock safety." While I'm coordinating legal responses, my family activated like the federal task force we'd accidentally become. Dad called his FBI contacts about civil rights violations under color of law. When local officials abuse their authority to deprive citizens of constitutional rights, it becomes a federal crime. Mom launched an IRS investigation into Vivian's construction business, because nothing says conflict of interest like hiring your own company to demolish the property you've been harassing. Mackenzie coordinated with the Sheriff's Department about Dale's illegal inspection activities. Turns out 3 other counties had been wondering why their certified inspector kept finding problems that required his buddy's construction services to fix. But the real breakthrough came when Mom's IRS training uncovered something beautiful in the property tax records. Vivian had been claiming our cabin as abandoned and condemned on her own tax filings for the past 2 years, reducing her adjacent property assessments by claiming decreased neighborhood values. She'd been literally profiting from harassing us before she even started the demolition process. "She's been planning this for years," Mom said, spreading financial documents across the kitchen table like evidence at a crime scene. "Every harassment action, every manufactured violation, it's all been building towards seizing this property for her own use." Then we discovered the smoking gun. Vivian's construction business had been pre-positioned to handle the demolition. She'd hired herself to destroy our property based on fraudulent inspections conducted by an unlicensed inspector who owed her money. It was like discovering the arsonist also owned the fire insurance company. That evening, while we're frantically preparing legal injunctions and federal complaints, Vivian held an emergency HOA meeting to celebrate what she called successful resolution of community safety concerns. The woman actually invited local media to document her responsible leadership in protecting neighborhood property values. The sound of her victory speech, broadcast on local radio while we packed family heirlooms, had a particular quality that reminded me of enemy propaganda, confident lies delivered with absolute conviction. She promised the lakefront would be returned to natural beauty once the non-compliant structure was removed. Translation, available for her personal expansion plans. But Vivian made one crucial mistake in her moment of triumph. She publicly admitted to orchestrating the entire harassment campaign, on record, with media witnesses, while federal agents were building a case file that already included racketeering, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. The taste of adrenaline during that 72-hour legal marathon was familiar, the same metallic urgency I'd felt before combat operations overseas. Except this time, the enemy had just revealed their entire battle plan on live radio while standing in a minefield of federal crimes. By Monday morning, our emergency injunction was filed, federal investigations were active, and Vivian Blackthorne had no idea she'd just declared war on the entire United States government. The woman thought she was bulldozing a cabin. Instead, she'd built her own prison out of documented federal crimes. Mom's IRS training for financial crimes investigation turned out to be the key that unlocked everything. While Dad was building federal cases and Mackenzie was coordinating with law enforcement, Cordelia Garrison was doing what she does best, following the money trail that criminals always think they've hidden well enough. "Dex, you need to see this," she said, calling me over to her laptop at 2 a.m. The dining room table looked like a command center, covered with printouts, tax forms, and corporate filings. The smell of strong coffee and the glow of multiple computer screens gave the whole scene a war room atmosphere. What she'd found was beautiful in its simplicity and absolutely damning in its scope. Hidden in a maze of shell companies and legal entities, Vivian had purchased 12 acres of prime lakefront property in 2019 right next to our cabin. The land was bought through something called Serenity Development LLC, with Vivian listed as managing partner. But here's the kicker. The development permits she'd filed with the county described a $2.3 million luxury glamping resort. You know, those fancy camping experiences for rich people who want to rough it with Wi-Fi and room service. Except the permit specifically noted that development was contingent on removing all non-conforming structures from adjacent properties. Our cabin wasn't just an inconvenience to Vivian, it was literally blocking her path to becoming a multimillionaire. Mom kept digging, and the pattern became crystal clear. 5 other lakefront families had been targeted with identical harassment campaigns over the past 2 years. Same manufactured violations, same inspector, same escalating pressure tactics. But here's what made it federal crime. Vivian had been using her HOA authority to artificially create property problems, then offering to buy the problematic properties at way below market value. "This is textbook racketeering," Mom said, highlighting financial transactions on her screen. "She's using official processes systematically to deprive people of property rights for personal enrichment. The FBI has an entire manual about this kind of scheme." The really beautiful part was how Vivian had documented everything herself. Her construction business tax returns showed $340,000 in suspicious consultation fees paid to various county officials over the past 3 years. Remember Dale, our fraudulent inspector? He'd been receiving monthly payments disguised as structural assessment retainers. But it gets better. Vivian's brother-in-law happened to be the president of First Mountain Bank, the same bank that had pre-approved a $2.3 million construction loan for Serenity Development LLC. The whole thing was a family business designed to steal lakefront property using government authority. We'd uncovered what federal prosecutors call a criminal enterprise. Multiple people using their official positions in a coordinated scheme to commit crimes for profit. The HOA harassment wasn't personal. It was just the retail end of a much larger wholesale theft operation. "Look at this timeline," Dad said, connecting the dots between property purchases, HOA harassment campaigns, and bank loan approvals. She's been planning this for at least 4 years. Every family she's targeted owns property that blocks her development plans. That's when I realized why my military intelligence training had been so useful in fighting this. Vivian wasn't just a corrupt HOA president, she was running a sophisticated criminal conspiracy that required mapping networks, following money flows, and understanding how multiple bad actors coordinate their activities. The power dynamic had completely shifted. 24 hours earlier, we were a military family trying to save our cabin from bureaucratic harassment. Now we were sitting on evidence of a multi-million-dollar federal crime syndicate that had been systematically stealing property from American families for years. Vivian thought she was bulldozing our cabin to clear land for her resort. What she'd actually done was hand federal law enforcement agencies a complete roadmap to her entire criminal operation, documented in her own tax returns and corporate filings. The woman had been so confident in her local political connections that she'd forgotten something important. When you commit crimes against federal employees, those crimes get investigated by federal agencies with resources that local corruption can't reach. Tuesday morning, we weren't just fighting for our cabin anymore. We were sitting on enough evidence to shut down an entire criminal enterprise disguised as community governance. By Wednesday morning, our family dining room had been transformed into something that looked like a federal command center. Military-grade organizational charts covered the walls, evidence timelines stretched across whiteboards, and 4 different government agencies were coordinating the takedown of what we now knew was a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. The smell of industrial-strength coffee mixed with the sound of laser printers running constantly as we prepared what Dad called the most thoroughly documented local corruption case he'd seen in 28 years with the FBI. Each family member had become the lead on their area of expertise, and watching us work together was like watching a precision instrument designed specifically for dismantling criminal conspiracies. Franklin took point on the federal prosecution strategy. "We're not just dealing with HOA harassment anymore," he explained, while organizing evidence into prosecution-ready files. "This hits every major federal crime category: conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of law, racketeering, mail fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering through the construction business." His FBI contacts in the public corruption unit were practically salivating over the case. When local officials systematically abuse their authority for personal profit, especially targeting military families, it becomes exactly the kind of federal crime that prosecutors love to showcase. The FBI manual literally has a chapter about this type of scheme, and Vivian had followed it like a textbook. Mom's IRS Criminal Investigation Division expertise turned into financial warfare capabilities that would make any enemy combatant nervous. She'd identified every bank account, property, vehicle, and asset connected to the conspiracy. "When we're done with the asset forfeiture process," she said with the satisfaction of someone who'd spent decades chasing tax cheats, "Vivian's going to wish she'd never heard the word lakefront." The really beautiful part was how her own greed had created the evidence trail. Every bribe disguised as a consultation fee, every shell company transaction, every fraudulent expense claim, it was all documented in tax filings that she'd signed under penalty of perjury. Criminal Investigation Division has software that can reconstruct financial crimes going back a decade, and Vivian had been helpfully creating digital evidence the entire time. Mackenzie coordinated the multi-agency law enforcement response with the precision of someone who'd spent years investigating explosives conspiracies. "Dale's fraudulent inspections don't just violate state licensing requirements," she explained while coordinating with sheriff's departments across 3 counties. "When he falsifies structural safety reports for demolitions, he's potentially violating federal explosives regulations. Every building he's condemned based on fake inspections becomes a federal crime scene." Her ATF database searches had revealed that Dale's inspection fraud pattern stretched across multiple states. The man had been systematically falsifying safety reports for profit, and at least 2 people had died in that 2019 bridge collapse that he'd certified as structurally sound. Federal prosecutors were already preparing charges that could put him away for decades. My role became what military intelligence does best: comprehensive threat assessment and strategic coordination. I created detailed operational timelines, mapped communication networks between conspirators, and developed what we call pattern analysis, showing how each crime connected to the larger criminal enterprise. But here's what made this family operation truly effective. We had legitimate federal authority backing every move. When Dad's FBI team requested surveillance authorization, judges approved it immediately. When Mom's IRS division launched asset investigations, banks cooperated without hesitation. When Mackenzie's ATF contacts coordinated with local law enforcement, sheriff's departments treated it as the federal priority case it had become. Within a week, we had a community intelligence network that would have impressed any military commander. The retired Marine who edited the local newspaper became our media coordinator. The Navy veteran who owned the surveying company provided technical expertise and detailed property assessments. 5 targeted families became cooperating federal witnesses, each contributing evidence of Vivian's systematic harassment campaigns. Even the hardware store owner, a Vietnam veteran who'd been quietly documenting which customers were being denied building supplies, turned out to have been creating an intelligence file for 3 years. "I knew something wasn't right," he said, handing over detailed records of Vivian's economic pressure tactics. "Just didn't know who to call until now." The technology arsenal we assembled would have been impressive in any federal investigation: professional surveillance equipment, financial analysis software, legal research databases, and military planning applications adapted for civilian use. But the real force multiplier was having 4 family members who knew exactly which federal resources to activate and how to coordinate between agencies that don't always communicate well. By the end of week 2, we weren't just investigating Vivian's crimes, we were documenting a complete criminal enterprise with enough evidence to support federal charges against a dozen co-conspirators. The woman who'd thought she was dealing with one helpless military family had accidentally declared war on a federal task force with unlimited jurisdiction and resources. The taste of inevitable victory was starting to mix with the coffee. Vivian had no idea that her entire criminal operation was now under federal surveillance, with every phone call monitored and every financial transaction tracked. By the third week of our investigation, Vivian must have sensed the walls closing in. Federal agents had been making routine inquiries at banks, courthouses, and construction sites. Her phone calls were being monitored, her financial transactions tracked, and her co-conspirators were getting nervous. That's when she made the classic mistake that every criminal makes when they